Unshameless plug for Claire. Those of you who have conferences coming up, please see her. She's willing to do this for you. It's not exclusive to EAPN. She's running a business that actually is designed to help us coordinate conferences like this. Without further ado, let me invite Sean to take you through the next panel. And just to mention that this panel will be about an hour, and then we will break for the tea break and go into the work stream sessions. I'll come back and announce what we need to do then.
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Sean Samuels from SJS Consulting, based in Johannesburg, South Africa. We focus on social justice in the region, as well as building a philanthropy infrastructure in Southern Africa. And I'm here with my esteemed panel, but before I come to them, I just want to sort of say we obviously have to address this notion and this interesting framing that says alignment is the missing infrastructure. So that's quite interesting, and I think this is what we want to unpack. I think it's critical for us to unpack this because, and the keynote speaker has given us a very interesting sort of segue into our conversation. But I think we can agree that we face fragmentation. There are missed opportunities, and we know that sectors are not aligned. And when we refer to sectors, this is business, these are the philanthropic institutions, it's government, and its community. And I think we were challenged yesterday by Brian, I'm not sure if he's in the audience, around having to reimagine economics within Africa, having to center justice and systems thinking in development. And are we sure that we know what it is that we need to fix? In particular, he was challenging us not to be echo chambers of the empire. I think, Brian, you traumatized us a bit there because you've created paranoia around, are we in our speak, in our work, in our practices, are we in a sense echo chambers of the global north and not centered in our own African sort of reality? I think Briggs also reminded us yesterday that we often make grants and we invest in development without, for example, understanding the national strategic plans of the countries we're involved in. And quite often we are oblivious to the intent of the Agenda 2063, for example. So this speaks to the disconnect. It speaks to misalignment often in terms of what we think we are doing, and the sort of reality out there. And so it raises a lot of interesting questions, which we'll unpack now. For business, what are we saying to business? Should you be aligning your goals and your goals to sustainable development, community needs? Government, is it that your policies and regulations have to align with the kind of objectives that we agree to? We talk about centering communities in their own development, and for our philanthropic institutions, what is it that we're in a sense saying? So it raises the question, are our institutions across these different sectors ready to meet the demands of real and meaningful alignment? Alignment extends beyond just needing to collaborate. Alignment around, do you understand the different mandates, the different agendas, the different interests, and how do we, in a sense, have that work in concert with each other? And so dealing with this question, alignment is the missing infrastructure, which we will find out now through our conversation. And this will be a conversation. So I'm not going to be posing a question to each of the panelists and then they respond. We will throw a question in, maybe ask a panelist to start the conversation, and I'm hoping that the panelists will engage each other. So on my left here we have Nadia Kist, who is the Executive Director of Bloodwater. Next to her is Kennedy Mugochi, who is the Regional Director of Hivos for East Africa. And then we have Dr. Tendai Moraurice, Executive Director of the Savio Institute. I'm going to ask them to say a little bit more, not too much, since we now just have an hour, about the organization that they represent, and in particular, just to speak a little bit about the work that connects to ecosystem across sector collaboration, how your work brings you to that. And in particular, with this headline that says alignment is the missing infrastructure, how do you respond to that in a way? Is it a diagnostic framing that we need to look at? Is it just a provocation? We always sort of say, let's just align more. Or is it a call to action? And perhaps let me start with Nadia. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Good morning, everyone. I'll share just a little bit about Bloodwater, and then, as you said, just get to the meat of it all. Bloodwater exists to resource the work of and to invest in the longevity and health of African-led, community-driven organizations in Eastern and Southern Africa. And our mandate is aligned missionally with local partners around responding to health disparities and the intersectionality of that with livelihoods or education or other sectors. For us, we frame all of our work around 3 core assumptions, and I want to start there because it's really central to the conversation of alignment, where alignment really kind of gets down to the heart of many things, but one of which that we've talked about a lot over the last day is mindsets and our core beliefs. So for our organization, we center our work around the core belief first that communities are the experts and the rightful custodians of their development processes. We believe that communities are already well-resourced, and partnership, therefore, exists to leverage and to advance what is already happening and what is already supported. And lastly, we believe that partnering with local leaders means actually following their lead and letting them be the ones at the driver's seat that we then have the privilege to even be a part of the journey with them. So for Bloodwater, in this conversation, we're really bringing a lens around community philanthropy as a form of collective action. And that collective action is a framing that happens at 2 levels that are really central to the way that we work and the way that we think about alignment and the way that we think about this multi-sectored approach of collaboration. That's community philanthropy, the work that is happening on the ground and the modalities with which it is supported, but then also our model of philanthropic engagement. As a collaborative fund, we actually mobilize grassroots philanthropic giving at an individual level and then pool that with other institutional funding to advance the work that's happening with our partners. So it's really coming back to the central point of people as agents of power and change, and not so much thinking about the different players at the table that we are waiting to come together to align and to then make possible a pathway forward. I think a lot about that statement that says, which I'm sure we've all heard in some iteration, that no one's coming to save us. We are the ones that are going to chart the pathway forward. And that's really the model of not just philanthropy that we access and activate, but also our view on partnership and collaboration, which the work is there, it's already happening, and so how do we then engage collectively to advance that mission as it's designed to go forward? So I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you. It's really impressive. Kennedy?
Good morning. As Hivos, we are an international development organization, and we work in partnership with both global and local stakeholders on issues of gender equality, diversity, and inclusion, civic rights in the digital age, as well as climate justice. As we can already imagine, these are very complex issues that we deal with. And from our experience, these complex issues can't be dealt or solved by one institution. Therefore, we strongly believe in multi-stakeholderism. By multi-stakeholderism, I mean we need to approach the problems by bringing different stakeholders together, governments, corporations, civil society, and others, to jointly solve the challenges that we face and to move beyond reliance on one institution to solve these problems. How we work is forming alliances in partnerships and in consortiums.
Thank you very much, Kennedy. And then Linda.
I hope this is working.
It is.
Okay, fantastic. Good morning. Apologies if my voice is not projecting well. I am battling a cold. With Civio Institute, we work at what we call the margins or the cracks. We have an appreciation of the various aspects of philanthropy in terms of how it's organized. So on one hand, you may find us in a community philanthropy meeting, because our mandate is to nurture philanthropy. You'll find us also with high net worth individuals. You'll find us with the intermediaries, because we have understood the challenge of silos that we are seeing in the philanthropy space, that many with the discussions are not cross-cutting. We have begun to develop these silos, and that could be the issue around the infrastructure. Then we're interested also in the ecosystem around policy and understanding how the work or the policy agenda of governments affects or influences philanthropic flows across the continent. We set up the Ease of Doing Philanthropy Index with an initial focus on Southern Africa. In 2025, we're expanding that to cut across all the other countries, where we're just tracking and trying to understand the ways in which governments come up with laws that affect or promote philanthropy. So in a nutshell, that's what we do at Civio in our philanthropy portfolio.
Great, thank you. So you would agree we have the right people on the table to address the issue of philanthropy. And then feeding off on Tenda, if I can just sort of remain with you and hope that you have recovered well.
Yeah, sure.
Whatever you say, we will ascribe to your flu. Just around the issue around policy and government, if we were to look at bridging policy and philanthropy, or bridging policy with the other sectors, government, corporate, and other, I think the keynote speaker reflected that policy is often the root cause of poverty and inequality. How would you describe this dynamic between policy makers, policy making, and the sectors? Is this one of collaboration? Is it contentious and confrontational? Or is it, would you say it's evolving? Because the question here is that if there is disconnect, what is it that we need to fix?
Sure. Yeah, I think I was having a chat with Evans, then I said maybe it's a tango of sorts, the dance that we're thinking of. But I think, just let me take you backwards. There's a consensus in Africa at the moment around the ease of doing business. Mm-hmm. Every country, especially where we are, I think it's rated at the top in terms of how to attract FDI, how to allow them to remit their profits, etc. So we have this movement where governments are opening up to foreign direct investors, and they're opening up for business, setting up hubs, coming up with these things to say you can register your company in 24 hours. That's in the for-profit sector. But when you look at what is happening in the non-profit sector, it's a total contradiction. We have a different situation. We're finding governments actually imposing more hurdles. In Zimbabwe, they are saying you can take up to 12 months to register. In Botswana, the same. In Tanzania here, a small grant that is just 10,000 and above, you have to register it. So we have a contradiction whereby there's a sector that is being privileged to say, we realize that you are important to our well-being. So we're going to make it easy for you from a policy perspective in how you register and even get tax concessions. Then we take this sector that is called humanitarian. If you remember what Mamadou was saying about the origins of Oxfam, that you're looking at policy, you're looking at interventions to deal with poverty, etc. Here's a sector that is geared towards that, but here's a sector that is to navigate bureaucracy. So there's that contradiction at policy. Then the question is, what have we done as a sector to really confront those challenges? Because I think business has done enough to lobby at a global level, national level, and regional levels, to lobby around best practices. But what have we done as a sector to begin to push to be recognized in the same way? I would say, and before my colleagues come in, I would say that one of the challenges that we have is what Mamadou was saying, the issue of communication. We've not told our story well. So I always say, who's going to mourn for us if we're to close down? People will mourn for business because they think business is the one that creates jobs. But the non-profit sector in Africa, in countries like Tanzania, Kenya, and everything, significantly contributes to employment creation, but we rarely talk about that. Significantly contributes to revenues of institutions such as Serena Hotel, but we rarely talk about that. So I think we really need to find a way of coming to a place to say, we're just not going to wait for governments to realize that we're important, but we're going to put ourselves in a place whereby governments understand our contribution to GDP, in taxes, etc.
So you're in a sense advocating we need to be a lot more assertive.
Yes, I
and
think we're
visible.
yeah.
Because we're talking about communication, policy integration, I think from the keynote, collaboration and technology. But Nadia and Kennedy?
Yeah, if I may come in, I would like to agree with Tendai, but also to push it a little bit further.
Okay.
From where I see it, how I see it is that relationship, particularly with governments and philanthropic organization and civil society is, I think, quite complex and often paradoxical. I think the relationship can best be described as a love-hate dynamic that happens. On one hand, we've seen, I think, cases of collaboration where perhaps in terms of humanitarian disasters and so forth, we've seen governments, philanthropy, and even private sector coming together to respond to a need. But sometimes it becomes also contentious, especially when power bases are threatened or there is a misalignment in terms of values and interests. So much that we see the hurdles that Tendai is mentioning around legislations, administrative hurdles, preventing the work of philanthropies to do their work. So this has put us in a very awkward situation in terms of wanting to achieve greater impact because the aspect of alignment, as Mamadou mentioned, that it's a practical necessity for us to achieve impact. But how do we achieve impact when there is issues also of trust deficits among the stakeholders and also, of course, value misalignment?
Yeah, that's exactly the point where I was thinking of as well. I think that we can all agree that we're living at a time where there's just such great global mistrust at a leadership level. And we're just moving into a time that it's not that we've never seen it before in history. It's pretty cyclical, actually, where there are these periods of extreme isolationism and then wars and movements that kind of bring us back to a shared sense of collective humanity, and it cycles again and again over centuries. And it's been a long time since there was this true movement of people to demand more at such a global scale. And so I think there's something to say about that in the context of this conversation, that it should happen not just at that highest level, but also to be thinking about the ways in which we are seeing organizing and collective action happening at the most local levels of the intersection of civil society and policy, and how can that then influence at the macro level what we want to see happen to be more conducive. And I think a perfect example that was shared in the keynote address, which is also kind of very central to our work, is the movement around the global HIV response, where that was this dual, two levels of people living with HIV globally were bringing governments to their knees to pay attention and to do different, to actually break patents, mobilize resource, and turn the tide of this global epidemic. And it was effective. And we saw not just policymakers come together, but private sector, multilaterals, every sector was represented at the table to make this response happen and make it effective. And but that would have never happened had it not been what was happening on the front lines of people that were coming together demanding to be seen when they were dying. And so I think there's just something to hold on to there of this two levels of action that need to happen at the same time.
Thank you for that. And I think the need for us to assert ourselves more, and you're speaking about a movement of people to demand more. We need to see quite a bit of that. I also subscribe to the Global HIV Response, so was part of that. But it raises the question is, are we learning from this? Because we see the success of this, but we're still going in our silos and fulfilling our own particular mandates. We are not indispensable. So Tendai says, who's going to mourn for us if we come or go? This love-hate makes it quite complex, and issues around value misalignment and trust deficit suggests that there's quite a bit that we need to do. But it also suggests, as the keynote speaker was sort of saying, that we need much more capability at the soft skills level in order to facilitate this. Now, Nadia, just staying with you, just around the ecosystem readiness for coordinated action. To what extent is our ecosystem ready for real coordinated action? And if you say yes, then I will subscribe to the MC's children that says you're lying. Yeah. But if you can be practical, because we often refer to agency, and I would like you to respond to this from a community point of view. Where does the community fit in this ecosystem, or where should they? We often refer to agency. We even yesterday spoke about how do we center community in development, and then this whole campaign that has unfolded over the last 2 to 3 years around shifting power and what that actually means.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer. I think I would just pose it for all of us to sit with. I think we are only as ready as we are willing to sit in the discomfort of aligning on what it really means to shift power and how we would define what that actually looks like, and for us to say that we were successful in doing that. I think over the last 5 years, what we've seen is a lot of momentum and action around how money is moving, as if that is the only true measure of the movement of power. And it's not. And I think that what we've seen with the massive shifts in the ecosystem around funding commitments and how quickly they can be turned off is a true reflection of power not being moved or shared, and also the expectation that that without it, everything will shut down. And we have seen that that is not the case. And I have shared this story many times, and I'll just say it again, that when the taps were closed around the funding mechanisms in January that supported a lot of the HIV response on the continent and in the world, a lot of our partners were gravely affected, ranging anywhere between 40 to 60% of some of their budgets. And the day after the stop work orders went out, people showed up to work, and they kept going. And that is not to celebrate, people doing work and not being compensated. That's not the point. The point is to say that the work was happening before, it will continue after. And that, to me, is a demonstration of power and agency, that it is not dependent on who else is coming to the table, and why it matters so much that we are actually engaging and looking at community models of collaboration, community models of philanthropic continuity that could be a template to replicate at macro levels, because that for us is the most consistent, the most successful, the most ongoing, irrespective of all the other dynamics that are happening. It doesn't stop. And so, yeah, I think that's really just something for us to examine. To what extent are we ready to think less about frameworks and these high-level conceptual ideas around, fostering collaboration and getting stakeholders around the table, and really just getting down to how it's happening every day on the front lines, where the work that is represented in this room is actually happening with continuity at a much greater scale than what we're able to do in boardrooms.
And I think that's so important. I think Yesterday, we were challenged to keep it simple, especially in our language. You know, English came on a boat. And so, so Tendai, if I could sort of refer to you around your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think, look, the challenge that we have in Africa and also what we call the philanthropy space, there are no boundaries to say this is African philanthropy. It's mishmash. We're mixing many things and calling it philanthropy. So there's global philanthropy coming with an agenda to Africa from different places. Then there's African resources that are also beginning to show up in the space. And all of them are driven by different agendas. The challenge that I've had in this space is even this shift the power, etc. At times, these are global struggles that Africa is being mobilized into without even understanding the position that we have as African organizations, our own vulnerabilities, etc. Because it's a very vulnerable sector at the moment. And if we do not confront that and begin to look at how do we plug resource mobilization. So I liked the hashtag we had when we were Trust Africa, which was Stop the Bleeding. Because at that moment, we were trying to link African philanthropy to the problem of illicit financial flows. To say the challenge of Africa is the reason why we sound like we're a recipient of global philanthropy is because we're losing more money than we get in through the phenomenon of illicit financial flows. So this was led by Thabo Mbeki and others. And we really tried to coalesce around the idea saying that if we had managed to plug the hole, these resources could actually be used today, the challenges that we're facing. So I think it is time, given what we're facing, it is time for Africa to really rally around, let me just use, you said keep it simple, its own hashtag. Africa needs its own hashtag around resource mobilization in the sector that it wants. Jerry Salon made a reference to what we call the scaffold. To say half the time we are fighting over a scaffold. A scaffold is the structure you use to build your own house. So half the time our discourses in philanthropy then begin to ponder a lot on international resources, which are borrowed resources, our scaffold helping us to build our own house. When do we kick away the scaffold? To say we have now got our own house, that we can now begin to say these are the rules and the norms. Because at the moment, we are so porous, we're exposed to many ideas and many agendas, and at the end of the day, we pursue those agendas, and we align with those agendas to get resources.
Which I think was the theme of yesterday's feedback to us. Is how do we, in a sense, maximize our own resource advantages for ourselves? Yeah.
Allow me to comment here and to add my thoughts around readiness for alignment for the ecosystem. I think number one, as we have heard, it's a practical necessity. So I don't think we have a choice but to try. But we also need to appreciate perhaps the elephant in the room, that we are living in an extractive neoliberal global system driven by relentless pursuit of super profits and inherent competition. So that in itself puts us in a very difficult position to achieve alignment. If I can become practical, for instance, when you were asking about readiness, what came to my mind, also from an African continent point of view in terms of our interests, I thought of almost 2 years ago when Africa Union and, of course, the government of Kenya came with a brilliant idea to have the Africa Climate Summit. This was born out of a conviction that we are always going to these global spaces as Africa. We are the hardest hit when it comes to the effects of climate change, but we don't have a common position. So therefore, we need to prepare and come up with our own homegrown African position. So this was 2023, September. But in leading up to the preparation for that summit, crevices started emerging. On one hand, philanthropies and local communities who are hardest hit by the effects of climate change, feeling that their voices are not being heard. And you have got African governments on one hand, having also coming in with their interests, let alone private sector. They are coming also with their own angle. So there was misalignment of values, so much that at the end of the day, in terms of even the declaration that came through, it was watered down to the extent that it didn't collectively represent us as an African front. So that readiness, in my view, is still, I think, missing. And I hear we are also going for another Africa Climate Summit, perhaps in September, in Ethiopia. And I'm wondering, to what extent did we learn from the previous aspects? But not to say that all hope is lost, because we also have other examples, I'm sure, where perhaps modules that can be improved, of which I'll share a bit later, on how alignment, I think, can be improved and work.
Which is a good segue into the other question. I'm just conscious of time. So do we have examples of cross-sector models that you know of where listening and learning and adapting together have been successful? In other words, where we've, in a sense, moved from transactional engagement to like real partnership. I know you've mentioned the HIV sort of elements in this, but do we have other sort of models that we can sort of learn from? Because it seems also learning is our key problem, right?
Can I
okay.
Can I just add something to the example of the HIV response? I think one of the points of its success, which goes back to that issue of like, what do we believe? What do we think and what do we believe? And how do we return back to the very core of just our humanity? And the common, if you think about even the word community, common unity, it's that common ground. I believe the success of the HIV response as a template had a lot to do with people demanding to be seen, and that individual life and the worth of life being central and demanding the attention and the engagement of the world. And so I think that's just like a very core element that it becomes almost impossible to not align around that, irrespective of what sector you're from.
Are you also implying that our demand culture has subsided quite a bit?
Yes.
Okay. Tendai?
Okay, I think there's, and this is Nadia's space, I think there's a lot to learn from community philanthropy. Whatever term we give it, community foundations, community philanthropy, because I think the kind of philanthropy we are trying to build on the continent has its origins in those concepts. And everywhere we go, in Malawi, in Zimbabwe, here in Kenya, what we're learning is the existence of willingness to come together. But the challenge that we have is the moment you move a layer up, we see these silos. The high net worth individuals and their foundations are doing something different from the intermediaries, and some of them that also mobilize resources from the global north are doing something. So I think the learning is to really say, I think we start off from a different perspective than usual. We start off by saying, what are the values we want to see in this space? And what kind of impact do we want to achieve? And where do we learn? Because the challenge is we quickly run to other regions to learn, and we abandon the lessons from the continent. I think there are enough lessons on the continent when you look at foundations that have been established from the ground up. And even the way in which we dismantled apartheid, colonialism, etc. The kind of sort of models that we came around with, around mobilizing resources. I was always told about how at Ahmadu Bello University, they had a fund to support the Zimbabwean liberation struggle and to support the struggle in South Africa. These were students supporting the liberation struggle. So you wonder, to what extent can that be reactivated around these issues to say there's a new struggle, and the issues around our economic emancipation, and we understand no one is coming to do it for us. How do we do it better? Based on the experiences we have had on the continent, I think it's hard to begin to lift those, but that's what is necessary to do. Given the challenges we have, like he's already made reference to extractive neoliberalism, it does not seem like, and this is a very important moment, it does not seem like the global north looks at us as development partners. I think they've made that very clear. And they've also made it very clear that we may have a problem of entitlement. So we are literally, like Steve Biko said, black men, you are on your own. Yeah. We are literally at a moment whereby we are on our own, and we really need to dig deep and find what worked for us to get to where we are now as independent nations.
And just given current events, we're really on our own. But could I sort of say, is it only crisis that would help facilitate alignment? You know, apartheid, even COVID, shifted behavior, but then again, learning comes into it. We soon went back to our normal, that's the sort of elements. Is it that there has to be a struggle and crisis that would force alignment or force this sort of bringing together of values and interests and common sort of agendas? Because it seems like outside of that, there is no incentive for us to really meaningfully align. Kennedy?
Yeah, it shouldn't be that way. But at the moment, it seems like we are forced by crisis because it becomes an existential issue. Therefore, we are forced as humanity to come together. After that, we go our separate ways. I think yesterday Brian challenged us, even within our space is philanthropies. To what extent do we align with, for instance, national development strategies in the different countries that we operate, or Agenda 2063 for Africa? So these are plans that are quite intentional and proactive and forward-looking, so much that you don't have to wait, I think, for a crisis. Then we can harness the collective power of our stakeholders to achieve something. So in my view, we don't have to wait for crisis, but at the moment, it unfortunately appears like that. Yeah.
And Nadia, could I sort of just ask, just around community, is community not factored into? I mean, we talk a lot about it, but in reality, community does not feature really in the ecosystem sort of engagements. In real terms, if you were to be honest. Yeah.
I don't think that it doesn't feature. It's I just want to go back to that point about mindsets and what, that question of what do we actually believe? And if we really believe that communities were the gatekeepers to progress, period, then at what point would they be a part of the conversation? Would they be the conversation starters? Or would they be a stakeholder to then be engaged after? And so I think it's less about whether or not they're there, but the question is when and why are they being engaged at a later point rather than the ones that are actually steering the conversation.
Do you have any views on this?
Yeah, I think, look, this idea of community, I've been in certain places where I've been asked, aren't you over-romanticizing community? Because the sort of the penetration of capitalist relations into the rural areas and sort of really destroyed those values. And so we really have to understand the moment. But for us is to even reimagine the idea of community. Because what we are finding for countries that send out many to the diaspora, the value of those remittances back into those communities. So community is just no longer just territory, but it's around association or commitment to a certain cause or a certain area. So if you look at it from that perspective and our learnings, and also the ongoing, because what Trump is doing in the United States is an ongoing onslaught on global capitalism, the way I understand it. So there's also an opportunity to rethink economic production itself around certain norms, was in many countries we refer to what our people do as the informal sector. In other more developed economies, we call that the cottage industry. So when you begin to think of that around those networks, around informality, but beginning to move into certain things, and if you understand the relations, the economic relations and the exchanges that are happening there to sustain each other's business, we really put that on the agenda of philanthropy. But you always ask, who funds business in Africa? Africans fund businesses on their own. Africans take their children to school through those small businesses. But if you're to build upon those, to ask yourself, do you need scale in terms of building big corporations, or you just need to replicate the exchanges and the models across and sustain communities and give them some dignity through this alignment with the laws to begin to understand that this is where our people are? Why don't we bring laws that are more permissible for the kind of things they are doing? Because if we're to track the amount of giving that happen out of those spaces, that's when we actually begin to realize the power of African philanthropy.
Kennedy, would you want to?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, we are having this conversation, rightfully so, because this is a philanthropy conference. would have expected perhaps members from government and also private sector to be here, at least to hear their views around why alignment is difficult or not readily available. But since it's more like a family affair now, I think we can also look introspectively amongst each other, philanthropies, as to how we can readily align. And one big aspect, or perhaps elephant in the room, is also around funding, which is diminishing. And I can't go overemphasize that. And what it has done is it has forced many of our organizations to be inward-looking. It's now more about organizational survival versus the impact itself, versus the work that we should be doing in the communities. For instance, 60 or 70% of the time is just spent on strategizing around how can we get more funding. I can perhaps try to suggest something that can move us a little bit out of that cocoon of mourning over loss of funding into perhaps the focus should be how do we preserve our impact or legacy. Because we have a real danger of reversals of the gains that we have made over the years. So rather than focusing on organizational or institutional survival, we need to look perhaps on preserving legacy and impact. In that way, perhaps we disabuse ourselves and now focus on the grand schemes, which we can also now start thinking around alignment and remove the competition aspect.
And that's very powerful. Thanks for that, Karen, because I think as we're aging now into a post-aid reality, just around the crises, and I think, Tendai, you're sort of very clear, maybe we also need to start reimagining the normal things we talk about, or we think we understand, like community of interest versus place-based, and sort of others. But if I could sort of say, just with a bit of futures thinking and the reality that we're now facing, the complexity, intersectionality, etc., what would be one bold, immediate step that you would sort of advocate for sectors to take in order to realign priorities for a healthier ecosystem? I know a lot has been said, but if you were to just pin it down to one bold step. Boldness. Nadia.
I am thinking about something that Rose shared during the masterclass about a survey. I don't want to misquote, so I won't say the numbers, but a survey that EPIC Africa had conducted on revenue sources to civil society organizations on the continent, and the highest proportion of revenue is coming from individual collective giving. And I just want to leave that as a very powerful reminder and co-sign it. Our institution for 20 years has mobilized over $45 million in small giving from individuals collectively. And that's where, going back to what I had said in the beginning, that statement that we have all heard a million times, like, we are the ones that are going to make the difference. No one else is coming. And so what we can garner together, even when it is in small scale contributions of time or treasure, it catalyzes movements. And I just don't want us to ever forget that when we see the world systems crumbling, shifting. There is no waiting. It's like preaching to the choir. Nobody here is waiting. We're all here because we are doing and we are being. And I think it's just to hold that as the bold step to take, one day at a time, one foot in front of the other. It's what do I have in my hand now, and how can I put that in a larger pool with others that have that aligned common goal, common experience that we can then move collectively in the same direction.
Thank you. Kennedy?
Yeah. I think for me, I can echo what also was mentioned by Mamadou around communication. we need to enhance our communication and engagement. We need to acknowledge that within the ecosystem, all the stakeholders, we may not necessarily agree on each other in terms of approaches, but for us to achieve impact, we need to collectively work together and align. How do we do this practically is communicating and engaging. I can think of a meeting where I went, I think first time with business around issues also to do with climate justice, for instance. I realized that the language that I was speaking and what they were also bringing on the table were divergent views. Not intentionally, but because of the siloed approach that we've been working. But with constant engagement and understanding each other and convincing each other, we're trying to nudge towards some kind of value alignment or mission alignment. So I think that is critical that we keep engaging. But also, it's not just with stakeholders within the ecosystem, like governments or private sector, but also amongst each other as civil society organizations, as philanthropies, that we need to constantly have these honest and difficult discussions around the existence of our work, how we can be effective, how we can engage, and how we can achieve impact.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll pick up from Nadia. Nadia, when we read Rose's report from EPIC Africa, I must be honest, I ran and I set up a platform called africagiving.org to mobilize individual giving. It's been a year or so now, and we've managed to sort of register on that platform over 160 organizations. And the giving has been great, but not great. But one thing that I'm saying is a big bet is we have to reimagine our future. We cannot wait to be dictated to. So individual giving is an entry point into a new conversation. And the more we shift mindsets around amongst us, because the challenge we have is NGOs and philanthropy organizations in our communities were seen as sites of privilege. So people have not yet connected or reconnected with the idea of giving to what looks like already is enough. So everyone who comes to you, they're asking for. But we're beginning to change. It's going to take time to change that mindset and to begin to influence, because studies are telling us that millennials and Gen Zs are given to giving. They really like the idea of contributing to causes. So based on those studies and also the support we're getting, we're actually beginning to say the big bet for Africa's transformation is how it's going to mobilize, on the one hand, individual giving. But like what the board chair was saying, corporates. There are lots of corporates here. Some of them have their origins on the continent. Some are coming from outside. We really need to begin to interrogate CSR beyond what it's doing. Because at the moment, it looks like it's a pet project of the chair, of the CEO. Yeah. But we really need to make sure that there's alignment, there's collaboration, and there's also commitment over the long run. Because corporates are really making profits out of Africa. They are not coming here just to be part of us. They are really here for profit making. But at times, especially in the mining sector, they do not reinvest enough in communities. So again, linking that conversation with an AU protocol, the Africa Mining Vision, Africa Union Agenda 2063, and beginning to say it has to start with us. There needs to be traction around what we are calling domestic resource mobilization. Because that's where we can actually build African resources and begin to sort of forge a new framework of development that is driven by African agenda.
Cool. Thank you. So perhaps at this stage, let me open it up to you as the plenary. We only have a few minutes left, so I'll only be able to take one or two comments. But may I suggest you don't ask a question, because that always begs an answer, as you know. Because if we ask questions, we then don't maximize the incredible wisdom and energy that's in the room. So I would suggest to you, leave us with, and as a segue into our work streams, because we're going to unpack these issues in a bit more detail, leave us with an insight or a challenge for us to consider. I don't know if there are roving mics, and I can't see from here, there's a light in the eyes, but if I can hand over to the MC just to to manage.
Thank you, thank you. My name is Moraurice Oyebo. I teach international relations at the University of Nairobi. Now, I find this idea of alignment absolutely interesting and really dangerous. These are my reasons. You know, we are going on with the assumption that development is this linear process and not a very chaotic process. And I think one of the panelists did mention something to that extent, that it involves challenging the status quo and power relations in society. Those are not linear things. Those are chaotic things. It's about politics. It's about who wields power and who doesn't. It's about who gains and who gets screwed. We are assuming that once we agree on policies, then development happens. And all we need is soft power to make that happen. Now, I think we know that when you're doing policy analysis, usually you have to figure out whose interest is being served by this policy. Isn't it? Whose interest is being served by this policy? And I'll say it again, that in any development process, someone is gaining and there is someone who is getting screwed in that process. It also assumes, finally, ladies and gentlemen, that everybody benefits equally from this thing we call development, which is not true. Now, I have been to a conversation where people talk about resilience. Now, I want to compare this concept or theory we are promoting here to that other concept called resilience. Somebody actually makes a presentation and says, when you see a community living in informal settlements in Nairobi, probably the worst in the world, then that is called resilience. All right? So this is what I'm talking about. I think we are looking at development from some lenses that are totally alien. That lens of linear process, we agree around a table, and so these are the narratives that feed the neoliberal framework we are talking about here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Edwin Sununda here from an organization based in Kenya called CBM, Disability Inclusion. Listening to the very useful conversations, I simply wanted to just make a comment that we are a movement, and we should not beat ourselves up too much with the assumption that movements are always aligned. In movements, you will have advocates, you will have journalists, you will have community workers, you will have teachers, you will have self-advocates, you will have leaders who emerge, and you will have critics. But for as long as the bigger picture is to drive change, which change translates to eradication of poverty, making life better, all of that translates into a sum total of a better world. And I cannot imagine a movement which only becomes very linear with people practicing the same thing, people at the same level, and people who do exactly the same thing. That will become self-defeating. So in my view, whatever else that all of us do, whether we are advocates, project managers, people working within the monitoring sector, holding each other to account, for as long as we do it with the bigger aim of improving the quality of lives of those who are left out or most marginalized, we are doing the right thing. Let's be inspired. Let's do it. And then finally, giving will never stop. Governments might change how they want to give, but we don't depend entirely on governments. Human beings are givers by nature. We will have philanthropists at the high net worth level, have philanthropists in our communities. We'll still have philanthropists through other foundations. Therefore, it's how we engage and change strategies, but ensure that communities engage and we continue meeting at the junction where the quality of lives of everyone has to be improved. Thank you.
Thank you for your inspiration. I'll take two more, just given the time that we have. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Michael Katagaya. I lead an organization called Evidence and Methods Lab in Kampala. I have the awesome privilege to come from Uganda. You guys
Welcome.
can't even clap for that because a country that has chosen, not like the neighbors, chosen to have one solid guy for like 40 years. And you guys don't know. So I have the privilege to come from Uganda. I'll make my comment very quick. So I'm glad that the moderator asked us to challenge ourselves, right? And I want to do that and to sort of propose practical things. And thanks to the panel, because you've been really awesome. So I have heard from the panel, but also through this conference and a couple of other spaces I've been in where we talk about shifting power, the idea, and not just an idea, but the fact that Africans are actually giving. We're giving a lot. It's great that there has been some effort to document, but I think we're not doing that well enough. We're not doing that all the time when we need to be doing that. So think about a project where a donor gives, let's say, $50,000, and usually they will say, we're not paying for salaries. You know, sometimes they will say, we're not paying for salaries. We're all making a small contribution. We are not buying equipment. We're not paying rent where the project is going to be hosted. And so you realize that the host institution or the host community is providing the space where the meetings are going to happen, and nobody is going to pay for them. People are giving of their time that we don't compute at all. So my challenge is, can we actually begin to be deliberate about measuring community or host institution contributions that is rarely documented? When we talk about power, when you realize that actually, when you document and realize that, okay, the donor gave $50,000, but the community contribution was actually $60,000, if we were to compute. Because the challenge with Africa, here we talk about, when we're measuring, we talk about poverty levels and all that. And think about frameworks like people living below $2 or $1 or $3 or $5 a day. And then you go to my village where someone will wake up in the morning and cut a jackfruit into two and they share it with a colleague. Half of the jackfruit is about $5 or more, right? And then lunchtime, and then when you think about the things that they're just picking up, because they're living out of the cash economy, and measurement frameworks usually look at the cash. So why don't we start to actually adopt to measure? So think about the donors on the other side asking the host institutions and host communities to actually document in cash how much they are contributing in terms of time. Many of our organizations have volunteers. I mean, that term is crazy because this means that these are people that are not actually paid how much they're supposed to be paid. So if a project officer should earn $500 or $200 on a project, but they're earning $200, who is meeting the difference? The $300. It means they're actually contributing that difference to the project. So just to challenge ourselves that we are going to court with no evidence, we're not documenting. So you cannot say the donor is contributing less than you are contributing. They say, there's this saying about data and that in God we trust, but everyone must bring data, right? Yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That is well received. And just one more, and then we would close.
I hope everyone can hear me from here. My name is Nyasha Njela. I am with Revolutionize, headquartered in the UK, but working out of South Africa. There's something that was said up at the panel, which was, do we need to be in a state of crisis or emergency in order for us to, to come together and make a change? And I think that there is a space where we forget that as the nonprofit sector, we're actually in a perpetual state of emergency because we are all solving problems. There are problems in the societies that we are living in. There are problems in the spaces that we are working in, and that's why we exist. We exist to solve problems. We exist to cover gaps. So within that in mind, then we need to change and shift to not be comfortable with the problems that we're solving, but actually be fueled into action. I'm going to be quick. The next part is government policy is critical when it comes to this. Like I said, I work out of South Africa. While the system is not perfect, but the fact that the government has put incentives for the private sector to actually give on a CSR level, broad-based economic empowerment level, it compels them to do something. So, which means when it comes to EAPN, I think that there is a critical space that you play in convening this, and government and private sector would have been here for us to have this conversation with them. And the challenge that I have to the rest of us is, how can we start thinking like private sector and also lobby with them to get incentives into the private sector so that they are compelled to give towards CSR and to give to our causes. If we're able to think like them, because at the end of the day, they're looking at the bottom line. They need to pay the shareholders. And if we're not thinking about that as well, if we're not beating them at their game, then we'll always be on the back foot. We need to start thinking in a different way. We need to start lobbying in a different way. And it's critical to have government relationships here. It's critical to have private sector here so that this conversation is not a conversation where it's just like-minded people and we're preaching to the choir, but everybody is involved.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. I think our time is almost up. I don't know if there are any closing comments you wish to make, or that we could...
Nadia? No, I'm
No? Okay. So thank you very much.